So let's review some of the key takeaways here from this particular lesson as we revisited some algebra review, and in particular how it affects rational functions. So the following restrictions can occur on the domain of rational functions. The first one that we kind of looked at and we kind of revisit very early is the idea that the denominator cannot equal 0. And that may mean we have to factor the denominator or we need to set it equal to 0. We need to figure out what values of x are going to make the denominator equal to 0 because we need to restrict them from the domain of our rational function. The other main idea that we saw is that the radicand, if there's a radical in our rational function, the radicand cannot be negative. And so we had to take whatever the square root was, and we had to set it greater than or equal to 0, and then figure out what values of x were going to have to be restricted that way. So those are the two main restrictions of the domain we're going to be concerned about moving forward. One of the things that we also take away from this lesson is that certain algebraic techniques, the two main ones that we focused on in this particular lesson were factoring and seeing if we could divide out a common factor, or using the conjugate if there was a radical in the function. But those two algebraic techniques, using a factoring technique or using a conjugate, they can be used to simplify a function. So we can simplify a rational function, but one of the key takeaways to really arm yourself with here is that the original domain restrictions still apply. So if you excluded a value from your domain at the beginning, it doesn't get to come back just because maybe it was something that got divided out. It still is a restriction that applies. And as we saw when we graphed some of these functions, that produces some unique things. It may put a hole in our graph because we still have to have that domain restriction. So know what causes a restriction on the domain, and then know that even if we can do some simplification, that restriction still applies.